So that's where we are, the long road from Selma. And it's actually become so much easier now. We can watch people marching over the bridge on our phones and just click on a hashtag. By the way, the hashtag trap is self-evident even in this session because I believe the hashtag for this session was hashtag Fletcher reads, which it turns out is being used by two different events, right? So be careful of the hashtag that you choose to occupy because somebody else might already be on it, or maybe we're sitting on someone else's hashtag. So this is series number 5 in our series of Fletcher Reads the Newspaper. The backdrop to this, for those of you who are experiencing this kind of an event for the first time, is to create a forum in which we can bring out the true interdisciplinary problem-solving nature of Fletcher. We always celebrate the fact that this is the place where we take on really hard problems. And the nice thing about really hard problems is that they are not easy to A, understand, and B, find solutions to. And perhaps one thing that we do know about these hard problems is that they're intractable and they do require many different perspectives on them so that we better understand what are the underlying drivers, what are the bottlenecks, what are the different tangled wires that cause them, and then bring in similar multidisciplinary perspectives to try and understand how do we actually take these wires apart and potentially put something back together, which could be a solution and a solution that lasts. Now, associated with that was our observation that every time we bring all of you, our students, into a classroom, we don't do interdisciplinary work. We actually do a single disciplinary work because each class is organized around a discipline, typically a topic where you do a deep dive. And we have phenomenal disciplinary experts across the school. And just a random sample is right here. We've got our marketing guru, Professor Bernard Simonin, our religion and the impact of religion on societies and political movements guru, Professor Prodromou. We have our media guru, Professor Schumacher-Matos, and we have our social networking guru, Professor Tunnard. I'm assuming these are all familiar names and faces for most of you. But as you can see, these are thoughtful intellectuals who have wide interests, but their real expertise goes deep. So they are not the interdisciplinary part of Fletcher. Across this panel is a multidisciplinary face of Fletcher. The real interdisciplinary part of Fletcher is actually on this side of the room. You're the folks who attend their classes, and then you hang out in the Hall of Flags, and after a couple of glasses of wine, get into that interdisciplinary mode of thinking and have these conversations where you pull a thread from one class to the other and actually come up with some interesting ideas and interesting conversations. And this is a way to try and kind of have these conversations while we are in the classroom. And the approach that we take in order to kind of force that discussion is to take a big, hairy story that has been hanging around on the front pages or close to the front pages of major media for months, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. And we try and understand why they're there and what kinds of underlying problems and opportunities they represent, and ask our experts to help us get behind them and get a sense of the underlying drivers and what could be going on. And is there an unsolved problem here? Is there an uncaptured opportunity? And then we turn it back to the interdisciplinary part of Fletcher to actually try and, upon some reflection from the words of wisdom that we heard, try and come up with some solutions. So at the end of this class, we actually do have an assignment. So this is a working session. The assignment is going to be, as all of you know, there is a bit of a problem going on in a part of the world that has always had a bit of a problem. And the latest turn on this problem is the question of what to do with the ever-growing menacing threat of an organization called Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, whatever form of acronym one chooses to use, but it has essentially got practically every Western administration and administrations in the region scrambling to figure out how to counter ISIS, on the ground, and how to counter ISIS on the platform in which they seem to be excelling, which is the digital platform, the digital communications platform, over which they have just seem to have taken control. So the challenge. This is a real, live, ongoing challenge that the Obama administration is grappling with, which is how to counter that message. Unfortunately, we are now in a responsive stage as opposed to being anticipatory about it, but how do we respond? So we'll turn this over to you guys to sort of think about, what are different ways in which we can take the digital platform, and the digital platform, the hashtag fill in the blanks, is largely a code word for how do you devise messages that are sticky, that can spread fast, that capture people's imagination, and most importantly, change behaviors. Okay, so that is going to be the task for you guys in a few minutes. But before that, we want to really try to understand hashtag-led movements, hashtag activism. How is it different from the days of Selma and Martin Luther King, which actually required hard work, long speeches, marching from one part of town to another, one town to another? How is it different now? Is there something about this digital activism, fingerboard or keyboard tactics, which are phenomenally powerful, efficient, productive in galvanizing, mobilizing people? Do they last? Do they change behaviors? Okay, is everyone clear on where we are going? All right. Rusty, our social networks guru.
Yes.
What's different about the digital platform and relative to the days of Selma? How do some of these hashtags just catch on and just remain sticky and spread like a fever almost within 24 to 48 hours?
Well, that's a question that really should probably best be addressed to Bernard, because, I mean, that's the marketing end of it. When I was preparing for this talk, I started to think about, I put on my consulting hat, and I said, how can we measure the success of this? How does one measure the success of a hashtag? Well, you have to measure the success of what the hashtag wants to represent. What we're really talking about, if we're going to focus on ISIS, is political movements, resistance movements, and all of that. So I went back and I thought, okay, let's do a baseline. What are we going to have as a baseline for this? And the baseline is, what are the key success factors of any organization that wants to resist or that wants to promote, in the political sphere at least? And I came up with 3 categories. One category was networks, naturally. No successful resistance movement has, in my knowledge, succeeded without having either gotten together people under a network that they've formed, or been able to master, more importantly, the connections between groups of networks of varying people. And I should tell you that when I was thinking about this, I thought, what have the successful resistance movements been? And I could only think of 3. There's not a long list. And I thought of 3 that have existed during my lifetime. And I'll lay these out for you, because maybe it'll give us a framework, and we can then talk about, okay, let's talk about success. The first one was near and dear to me because it happened when I was in college. It was Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, that existed for most of the 1960s and was successful, not to the hopes of its most anarchic members that wanted to overthrow the U.S. government, but it was able to really turn the United States against the Vietnam War. And that took a lot of doing. And it also took 10 years. The second one is Solidarity in Poland. Solidarity was able to eventually overthrow the Polish government. It was not done directly, but it was done through years of insistent promotional work and just literally being there for 13 or 14 years. But they were successful. They got rid of the Polish government, and in fact, they were instrumental in getting rid of communism in general in that part of the world. And the third one that was successful, and the only one that I know of that was successful in deposing a leader and getting a new leader in, was Serbia. Now, okay, I happen to write my dissertation about that, but it was, in a way, that also, by the way, took 10 years. So first of all, we're talking about one of the things about success for resistance movement is it takes time. They're not these evanescent, ephemeral hashtags that were.
So Rusty, if I may just, pardon me for interrupting, if I sort of think about the path to success, there are two phases to it, right? So one is the phase of actually mobilizing, people, building awareness, getting a critical mass of people, around a particular theme. So that's sort of stage one. And very often movements fail right there.
They do.
And then there's stage two, which is it changes behaviors. Right? Yeah. For some, it keeps going, and for others, it could peter out. So my question is, as we transition from those iconic movements that you just referred to the digital movement, Kony and post-Kony era, how are we doing on phase one and phase two?
Well, I don't think we're doing particularly well on phase two. I think behavior change is a I'm really not qualified to talk about behavior change.
Well, what about phase one? Are we doing better in phase one?
I think we can beat the drums extremely well. I think awareness is what the social media is all about. But that's the easy part. I mean, we've got the three success factors that I thought of when I thought of movements were networks, organization, there's being organized and having an organizational structure, and images. Mm-hmm. And message control is one. And boy, there are no movements that I know of that have done the first two well, but in the world of images, it's very powerful.
Okay, so now here's another follow-up question, and then I do want to turn to Bernard, because we are now getting into the territory of imagery, branding, and how that is powerful in affecting behaviors. But we all know that there's certain hashtags that catch on. But that can't be the only hashtag that was out there in this whole Twitter sphere and all the other spheres. There are a whole bunch of competing ones. Do we have any understanding as to the next movement I want to organize? Do I know whether hashtag Fletcher reads is going to catch on, or how do I do it? Is there a method to this?
Well, I think that's the whole point of it, is that you don't know, and
okay.
You do it and you jump in, and that's what it's all about these days.
And you jump in, and then what? You just maximize volume?
You see what works, and you follow the stuff that works. I mean, I was reading that ISIS has somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 hashtags that refer back to ISIS Central, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. And God knows how many Twitter accounts. It's in the tens of thousands.
46,000.
Yeah, in the tens of thousands.
46,000. That's the conservative
versus
number.
The State Department's counterterrorism, 350? I think the article said. Mm-hmm. So there's a number right there.
Okay, wonderful, Bernard. We're talking about your field, right? We're talking about branding. So a hashtag is essentially a brand. It's something that people cohere around, and a brand it serves two purposes: gets attention, changes behaviors. What's different?
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me today. So a couple of thoughts in my mind. I think, Bhaskar, you started by pointing to the need to always look at problems and solving problems, and sometimes marketers like to look at it differently and say, what are the opportunities, and how do we leverage our services, products, our brands to take advantage of those opportunities as well. So we can look at this way. From a marketing point of view, I think there are different spaces here. Today we are talking about social movements, causes. We are talking about branding, hashtags, digital strategies. So there are overlaps, but I think we could actually dig into any one of those spaces at length. Going back to the question on the branding, the purpose, if you think about it, a brand, in English, actually, the term, or even in French, la marque, is just the act of branding cattle. You are just differentiating for the purpose of identifying. So maybe with my hashtag, my brand, I'm identifying through an index, a terminology, a thought, a product, an organization, an idea, a movement, and that's the first basic purpose. So actually we identify, we can classify, we can sort, we can find actually a collective. Then we can evolve. I think it's not just identifying. I think ultimately a brand takes a different meaning. It's a promise. I think I like this brand. I like to follow this hashtag discussion, this movement, because it's a promise. The brand will deliver on something that is maybe relatively clear in my mind. It's also a promise on consistency. So I know what I'm going to get. There are variations, but ultimately, I'm going for the brand and this hashtag because I think I'm searching on this, and I think I'm pretty sure what I'm going to get out of it.
So just for an example, if you think about the Golden Arches, McDonald's, so it's not just consistent fries, no matter which outlet I go to. It also means clean bathrooms when I'm traveling on
all of that. And interestingly, I think McDonald's is one of the cases used as a hashtag campaign that really went very, very badly. I think it was the McDS story, and inviting people to tell their stories, their experience, and people unleashed on it, not just the positive stories, but a lot of the negative stories, and suddenly it backfired. So, talking about consistency of the brand, it's about not necessarily the best thing I could ever get, but I know that it's a reliable assessment of what the proposition is for this product brand. It's also more and more an issue now. Brands evolve into an element of an emotional space. So it resonates with us. It tells something about us. It's a badge as well. So, I could be this armchair activist possibly, and, I can actually collect my badges here, and maybe it's meaningful to me. I may believe that I'm participating in the movements. Am I engaged or not? It's a different question, but it's a badge. It tells something to me, but about me as well. It can become, the brand can become highly emotional, actually. It's something that takes on human personalities. We talk about brands that are rugged or that are luxurious or who knows what. So the brand ultimately for me is a promise. Can we deliver on it? And what is different here, I think, is with the audience. I think we're talking about what is new today as opposed to before. I think the brand was owned in a way by organizations. Going back to the organization, could manage it, could control its meaning. Today, with our hashtags as brand that are spontaneous, you own it. Everyone owns it, and that's very scary for a mindset that is used to deal with organizations. We need to control the promise and also the message out there. So that I think is new. It's a collective ownership rather than a governance structure that will actually shape.
Sure. So if I may just sort of touch on a specific hashtag, which is the news is unfolding as we speak. Hashtag Black Lives Matter, right? I mean, Ferguson is exploded all over again in a somewhat different form. If we just look at that particular hashtag, and it is, as you mentioned, it's very different from a McDonald's owned brand identity. It is a collective. It could, who knows where the authorship came from, but now the propagation and the ownership of it is collective. If you just look at these four, the four criteria that you mentioned, Bernard, and just use hashtag Black Lives Matter, how does it do on these criteria?
I think those are purposes and benefits. I think the criteria of a good hashtag, people talk about the do's and don'ts, I think you want it to be highly differentiated for one thing. So it has to communicate the identity, which here it does. I think now, if you say Ferguson, if you read it in the press, I think it identifies exactly a set of issues, a place, and a problem.
So we'll give it 4 out of 5 stars. I'm just putting words in your mouth.
I would assume so, yes.
We are hard graders, so no 5 stars anyway. Okay.
then I think you want to have relevance. I think for a brand to be meaningful, it has to be relevant, and that speaks to an audience. So today we are dealing with an audience that is familiar with, I think, the technological base, the space. But as a marketer, I have to remind you that if you are not thinking segmentation, you are not thinking. So there are a lot of people excluded from the kind of conversation we are having today, and for whom this is irrelevant. So you have to look at demographics, access, and the rest. So in terms of audience, is it relevant? And I think the Ferguson has to be relevant to across today as you look at it, but for this generation, people who actually are used to be active with their social, various social platforms. It has to be relevant, it has to be meaningful, differentiated as well. And in this case, I think there would be limited other hashtags, I think, that may gravitate around that.
Okay, and how's it doing? And just, I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but
yeah,
we're just sort of...
In terms of relevance, I think it has to be multiple stars or pluses, highly relevant.
All right, we'll give
today.
it 3.
Yeah.
Okay. How about some of these others? And we don't have to march through all of them. Just to get a sense of how some of your criteria translate into one specific example.
Here, the promise is in the eyes of the beholder. I think it goes back to what are we trying to accomplish with this movement. And I think if it's part of being part of a conversation is one thing. Marketers tend to think in terms of hierarchy of effects. So I need to be aware of what's going on first, and this may make me aware of an issue, a problem. And then, I need to maybe understand it a bit better. I need to look at, be informed about it. And maybe the conversation through social media will inform me about some of the facts. But the marketer tries to push it further and say, well, now that I understand it a bit better, do I like it? Do I have affinities, positive affinities and perceptions related to this movement or not? Then I think Rusty was talking about it. You need to move all the way to not just liking, but committing to it and being willing to act on something. So marketers look at decisions to buy or not, here decision to join the movement, or actually to go and march, do something. So the behavioral element, and then I think you could even look at the next stage, which is owning, I think, in a way, the brand or the movement to a point where I'm an evangelist. I don't know if it's a good word in this case, but a brand evangelist, as we say, and actually I'm going to be the one who will be influencing others to join the movement.
So Bernard, let's mix it up a bit, but I think where we're going is, you mentioned action. So, how much action does this generate? And that really takes us into this phase 2 part. And a prerequisite for action is that it needs to have an emotional component. I mean, it needs to translate into some change.
Exactly.
In terms of my inclination to behave.
Right.
And Black Lives Matter seems to have become, a fairly emotionally charged issue, no matter where you sit on the spectrum. And it has also generated, whether it's productive action or not, it has generated a certain amount of action. So we can individually give some stars here. So I think this is a great way to try.
I'll just finish on the action. I think marketers love to talk about a call for action. So if you are going to tweet something, or even maybe a clever hashtag, could build in actually the call for action.
Yeah.
Maybe Ferguson is not it yet because it's just the location, but you could be clever about making sure that it's not just about a conversation, it's about doing something as part of the identity or the brand identity itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Edward, you were the conscience of National Public Radio. Which itself claims to be the conscience of any thinking individual. So you're the conscience of the conscience. You're higher than the Pope. So what's the role of the media in mediating, how we connect with these hashtags and these messages?
Let me look at that in 2 different ways.
Okay.
The media does indeed, of course, have a role. The traditional media is very involved in these things. Let's look at it from the point of view of the audience, and let's look at it from the point of view of the media and what you're transmitting here. And so we made a brief mention of their techniques. I mean, these are all sort of fundamental principles of marketing, which are great. Next thing is how then does that translate? What do you do with that? It's not enough to have the principles. It is also, what do you do with it? And so much of that is then your social marketing strategy online. We're talking about doing things digitally, right? So then that means oftentimes trying to do strategies like hitting on what's trending topics. And there are all sorts of tools that marketers have today and that the news media has today. News media essentially copying the marketers and getting much better at trying to do it. Because if we want to survive, then we have to be able to take our stories and get them out there much faster, responding to what the audience wants. And I'll come back to that audience question. So when you're looking at what the news media is doing, they're trying all these various tactics of trying to reach what's trending in the society. That's not any different than what the advocates are doing or should be doing if they want to have some impact. And trying to get your message out real fast. And so then you try to find what kind of messages can you have that connect with what's trending at that moment. You can't add something that's disconnected. You can't suddenly have your brand. If your brand is not connected to what's trending, it's really seen badly if you try to just jump on the
So
bandwagon.
you basically have a surfboard, you're looking for the wave.
That's right.
and then-
You're looking for the waves, got to be the right waves.
Yeah.
And so you try to jump those waves, and that's how you essentially expand your audience. And then you try to reach all the various different influencers that get you that viral impact that get out there. And so that's great, right? But now you're talking about a campaign that's not just branding. It's a different kind of hashtag strategy. So branding is long term. Campaigns are short term. So many things, in fact, trend in just minutes online. Things like the Black or Ferguson or these things will have weeks, perhaps, maybe months, probably not more, right? So then you have to figure out how do you keep your various campaigns going. So now let me come back then to the audience side of things. A wonderful study was done by Pew, recent study done by Pew in collaboration with the Social Science Research Foundation, networking all these various campaigns, hashtag campaigns. What did they find? On political subjects, unfortunately, is just as polarized online as it's polarized in the everyday society. That we're doing all this hashtagging, including Ferguson, et cetera, right? If you don't believe, if you don't support that, you're not even reading those tweets or reading those Facebook posts. In other words, so many campaigns are in fact building support with your own base, mobilizing your base, which is terrifically valuable. But the ability to convince people who don't agree with you is limited, particularly on political issues.
Is it getting more limited because of the electronic corridors that we've created?
That's a tremendous question. It seems from the outside like it is getting more limited. There are exceptions, of course. There are subjects that do jump the political divide. And needless to say, so many campaigns, what you really want to do is you're trying to get influence at the margin. You're trying to expand your group. Even if it's a product, essentially you're trying to expand the group that's interested in your product. You know you can't appeal to everybody. But the internet lends itself, in fact, to specialization, fragmentation, and becoming more limited to affect the broad public.
So again, to bring you back to the media's role here,
Right.
if you're NPR versus Fox News, what do you do? Fox News, well, we know what you would do if you have a particular corridor that you want to march down on. Let's come back to NPR, which claims to be objective. Is it?
Yes, some media, and NPR is one of them that manages to get over this hump a little bit. The traditional media still has a little bit of an agenda-setting power, not what it used to have by far, but there is some media that gets to, maybe it doesn't get to the true believers, the NPR for the, in this case, believe it or not, true believers on the left and true believers on the right. Both of them are very critical of NPR. Everybody thinks that all the criticism of NPR comes from the right, and that's not true. I got far more criticism from the left than from the right. But the NPR, the New York Times, even though it too is more to the left, still does manage to get a lot of your centrist people and still manages to have some influence with that group.
Okay. Okay, wonderful. We'll come back, revisit many of these issues. And I do want to begin to make a transition to some of our problem-solving part of this session. But to ground us on the problem, to try to understand the challenge, Elizabeth, this is a topic that you have a lot of familiarity with in terms of trying to understand the power of particularly religious or movements that use religion as a platform, and how they propagate, particularly in terms of communication. Let's put aside actions on the ground. Just we're focusing on the communication, the media side of things here, and also help us understand what the State Department and the White House is planning and wants to do in terms of a counter message.
So I'm going to begin with a confession, which is that I'm the person who doesn't understand hashtags very well. And if you consult with my 16-year-old daughter, she'll verify that. So having said that at the outset, one of the things that I've been struck by is listening to the conversation is that there's a sort of thematic consistency. In the first case, when we talk about hashtags and social media, and what's different about the use of social media for nonviolent and violent social movements, I would submit that there's really not a lot that is different. Maybe I'm taking a contrarian position, but from other more what's the value added, I guess? Mm-hmm. And I would submit that I'm not convinced that there is a lot of value added, because on the face of it, hashtags, they're fast, so speed is different, okay, in terms of other traditional forms of communication. Alacrity. Comprehensiveness is different. You can, touch literally the entire globe if you wish. But after that, the uniqueness factor seems to break down. And the thematic consistency here about the focus on kind of sectors and marketing and branding that ultimately, whether we're talking about NPR or Fox, that ultimately people read and hear what they want to hear. When you're using branding at the end of the day, we're talking more and more about niche branding. I don't see that brings so much different to the table than we're talking about hashtags or other forms of social media for the purposes of social movement.
So if I may just sort of test that proposition with three sample points. So one is going back to Martin Luther King, right? So it involved oratory, it involved charisma, it involved brilliant craftsmanship in terms of language, it involved physical marching from place to place, it involved sit-ins and lunch counters, it involved a whole bunch of things. So that's kind of one generation. A second generation, a little bit closer to home, is a grainy video of Osama bin Laden, kind of firing shots in some random mountaintop, right? And very low quality, and it's just video, and occasionally people get to see it, and other places they don't. And now we have the hashtag generation, at least 46,000 Twitter followers affiliated with ISIS. Each Twitter follower has, on average, 1,000 each Twitter account, on average, has 1,000 followers. And even if Twitter shuts 40,000 of them down, there'll still be 6,000 of them that will be posting and reposting tweets.
Okay, so a couple of things. I mean, I would have inserted another example here, and this goes back to, can we identify, modern successes when it comes to social movements and revolutions? I would have inserted the Iranian Revolution. Mm-hmm. And let's think about the Iranian Revolution. One of the most important features of that revolution was the cassette tape, and clearly I'm dating myself here, okay, but the cassette tape, and Khomeini's use of cassettes and his followers, retaping of those cassettes, and this goes to networking, distributing those cassettes through the old-fashioned human interaction called networking, human networking. So here again, I'd sort of ask us to consider whether or not what we think seems to be so unique and so revolutionary in terms of no pun intended, hashtag revolutions, whether it really is, or whether, as we see, for example, in terms of nonviolent change and democratization movements. We see that there must be an electoral component. This goes back to campaigning. Without the electoral component, you don't get sustainability, you don't get durability, you don't ultimately get people to vote, you don't get a change in outcomes. In terms of the violent social movements, and in this particular case we're talking about ISIS, I think one of the things that's interesting about ISIS is, yes, certainly they have 46,000 conservative estimate independent Twitter accounts, but the fact of the matter is that ISIS works according to the logics of a state. So they are supplementing the use of social media, and not simply one single type of social media. They have multiple platforms. They use them to appeal for specific purposes to diverse constituencies. They use, for example, Dabiq and the messaging even in Dabiq, for example, to appeal to various sectors. This is for you who may be a young woman who feels like you can't get out of the house, so you're going to be able to sort of have your own personal revolution. This is for you who's interested in, making bombs and other kinds of explosive devices. This is for you who's, interested in lone wolf, violent activities. So even there, they recognize through that particular product, Dabiq, that they want to have a kind of sectoral appeal. And then they use that in addition with hashtags and with Twittering, et cetera. But ultimately, the interesting thing about all of those products is the kind of boomerang effect that they can have. Because as easily as they can build momentum for change, they can create blowback. Because it's very easy then to apply one's own personal metric to whether or not the movement itself is succeeding. And that's something, in fact, that ISIS is very concerned about. And that's why, again, they're adopting more traditional state-building, approaches to recruiting and sustaining their message, and therefore growing their followers. Mm-hmm. So I think that for me, what's most valuable about this exercise is that we can begin to sort of identify the anatomy of social movements in this, digital age. And what we see in terms of that anatomy and that architecture is that these digital technologies, if deployed alone, are not successful in doing all the things that you've talked about in terms of marketing and certainly in terms of sustainability and ultimately any kind of permanent change.
Mm-hmm. Great, phenomenal. So this is, you can see just in a brief, 25 minutes, we have covered an enormous amount of territory in just getting that historical context of the life cycle of a social movement. How much that life cycle has changed as we've gone from the brick and mortar and the shoe leather age to the digital age, or maybe it hasn't changed a whole lot. Some of the perhaps unintended or unexpected consequences of the digital age, where we might be getting more and more siloed into individual corridors, and there may be some organizations that could actually use the electrons to jump over some of those silos. You've got a sense of the stickiness of these messages, these brands, stickiness, and there's a way to actually evaluate them with some criteria. How relevant is it? Does it translate into action? What's the prerequisite for action? And who are the different audiences you're trying to reach? So we have a sort of at least some groundwork. And if I may ask you, Elizabeth, for one more piece of groundwork, which is the State Department now has a counter that it's put more money into a unit. That's not a new unit, but it's a unit that was basically moribund for a while. So what are they looking for, and how can this group of problem solvers come back with a digital counter message?
Sure. So many of you are probably already familiar with this. So the White House's CVE summit 2 weeks ago, the Countering Violent Extremism Summit, one of the main takeaways is that the State Department office that deals with countering violent extremism, the specific project of developing counter narratives is going to be ramped up. Interestingly enough, there's also been a lot of critique of the big rollout because there aren't a lot of resources that are going to be dedicated to that, either financial or personnel. So there's real question about whether it's going to.
That's where we're
have
helping them out a little bit
Right,
today.
it's going to have, so, right, so if you're, on your next Washington trip, that's the place to go. So whether or not there'll be any efficacy. And I know, again, that counter-narratives are all the rage, and I think that we are looking at a kind of fad when it comes to counter-narratives, because really, at the end of the day, in terms of the narratives and the counter-narratives, yes, they're important. And I was just in Washington at the Center for American Progress earlier today. They presented their a new report they did on Christians in the Middle East. And one of the things that we talked about there was the narrative of who belongs in the Middle East, and the fact that the narrative of who belongs, needs to be deployed in various spaces. So in the media space, in the public policy space, in the academic space, and most importantly by those on the ground who are affected by this. So the State Department, I think, has a real uphill battle if it doesn't have a lot of financial or human resources behind it. And secondly, the success of narratives and counter-narratives ultimately, I think, is really going to turn on the conditions on the ground. And that's where, again, I go back to the way that that ISIS has functioned, because they're beginning to deliver social services to those who support them. They have the capacity to generate financial resources that then go back into weaponizing them, but also providing these social resources. So the way that the counter-narratives will play out, and I think whether or not they'll be consumed and accepted or consumed and rejected, will depend on the facts on the ground. So again, I go back to this combination of sort of modern, postmodern, and more traditional forms of making social change.
Absolutely. So we need to obviously think about this as part of an integrated strategy. And who knows what's going to happen in terms of boots on the ground or anything on the ground. It's all going to go through Congress, and no one's going to try and predict the outcome of that. So at least for our purposes, if we were to assume that the on-the-ground elements are just moving along on a parallel track, how do we develop a counter-narrative to the very powerful ISIS narrative, which is clearly done some pretty remarkable things. First of all, in just absolutely terrorizing an intended audience, making another segment just completely repelled by the amount of propensity to violence that they have shown, and at the same time attracted an audience in very powerful ways. So simultaneously accomplished all of that. So how does the White House, the new committee, sort of develop this counter-narrative? First of all, what is the hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Bring Back Our Girls, hashtag Je suis Charlie, the many tags that actually just caught on and were followed with remarkable speed. How does one do that? Is it a hashtag or is it something else? And second, how do we actually try and create a campaign that satisfies many of the criteria that Bernard talked about? And more importantly, coming back to Rusty's point, gets us from phase 1 to phase 2, actually changes people's behaviors, translates into action. Okay? Comment, question? Okay.
I'm trying to, sorry. You're going to have to speak into this.
So are you trying to answer the question?
Yes.
Okay, so if you don't mind just holding your horses for a moment. So that's where we're going to turn to,
Sorry,
right?
I'm from Iraq, so this is like...
Then we'd love to get your insights, because for many of us this is a distant war, and for many others it's much closer to home. So we definitely want your insights here. But before we do that, what I'm going to suggest is we actually break into really small buzz groups and have a conversation, and then let's share it with everybody. Before we do that and go into that part of this session, does anybody have any questions or anything kind of follow on, or a comment, or even a disagreement with what you heard? Yeah.
But Bhaskar, can I just add in one more piece to the assignment?
Yeah.
It might be useful to consider two examples that are somewhat related. Number one, the Gezi Park events in Turkey a couple of summers ago that seemed to have such traction, but were short-lived and ultimately didn't produce the kind of well, they produced the immediate change, but they didn't produce long-term change. So dissecting the Gezi Park movement and the way in which social media was used there. And then the other case, the case of Boko Haram in Nigeria, and the way in which the Bring Back Our Girls hashtag, was, just exploded and then, as quickly has receded into the, darkness of cyberspace. So looking at other cases that have worked and that haven't worked in producing change, and how you might, what you might take away from that in terms of the task at hand.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just take a couple of questions, and I apologize for cutting people short, but I do want to kind of get into a discussion. I think, Fran, did you have your hand up here? Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I want to challenge, and it will result in a question. I want to challenge that hypothesis that you put out, that there is actually not that much difference between past technologies and what the digital sphere can do. Because I think a certain probabilities of the digital world do make a difference. And one of the, or I think two properties stand out. One is that there's extremely low barriers to entry as compared to all the other technologies that were there before. And the other thing is that to produce more comes at no cost. So digital signs, if you do one sign or 1,000, it doesn't matter because there's no marginal cost. And I think one thing that plays a very important role in how the digital media or digital signs are consumed is that consumers choose more and more authenticity over brand, or authenticity becomes a brand. And that's actually what my question is. So in terms of, how we think about branding within the digital world, would you agree? And is that something that has always been there, or is that a difference that we actually have to think about? Because, to play the devil's advocate, I think if you burn for your, if you're very passionate about what you want to do, that will never be counter-narrated by people living in Washington and working there from 9 to 5, developing some counter-narrative versus people that are very passionate about what they're doing.
Okay, I think we got the question. The couple of some pushback on the difference between pre-digital and post-digital, and the second is, if there is so much passion behind one narrative, is there any hope for a counter?
I think you're absolutely right with the authenticity element. That is an important attribute a brand may or may not have. You could look at campaigns by Pepsi, the Refresh campaign. We are starting social movements. We are contributing to it. But you know what? We are not credible. We are not authentic about it. We are just there to sell soda in a way. So it doesn't go away. You're right. There is a limited cost to produce. I think you're right. At the same time, I think of us as insects, cockroaches. And, we are bombarded with messages and hashtags, and probably 4,000 or 5,000 branded messages a day. So we evolve like cockroaches. It's like the senders are spraying us with that, but we develop immunity. So then the marketer has to come up with really a change of paradigm, or some creativity, or more authenticity, or something else that will make us stop and notice. So it's a race of some sort. Yes, you can produce, but it doesn't matter. Do we hear it? And now we are competing with this really bombardment of messages and stimulations. And I agree. I think we are talking about tactics here, whereas I think the true battles are about, I think, strategies, and there are many other elements that need to be discussed. Yeah. Yep. So we can optimize the tactic today, but not the grand strategy. Yeah.
Absolutely. Elizabeth, very briefly, I don't know if you have a very short counter to Fran's pushback that digital is indeed different.
I don't really disagree with you, but I think, again, your point about, no amount of, wordsmithing in a good hashtag is going to really outweigh, as you said, if somebody feels passionately about something. And that's why I think, again, what's important is to recognize the utility and the specificity of social media and digital technologies, but if they're not integrated into broader strategies and, ultimately strategies that rely on a change on the ground, that they're not effective. They're ephemeral.
All right, Edward, very quickly.
Just a footnote. It does go global very fast, like Fran says, and you get the much bigger numbers. But to some extent, you're hitting the same kind of people globally. Global campaigns can be very clumsy. Local campaigns actually work much better than global campaigns. And you can argue that what happened with Boko Haram in Nigeria, there was a lot of backlash inside Nigeria to that campaign that it may have hurt as much as it helped. So there are complications, additional complications to what you raise about what happens on the digital side.
Okay. Okay, Amir, get the last question. Or comment.
Question, building to some extent off Fran's. Two perspectives, one from psychology and the psychology of persuasion. If I know you're trying to persuade me, I don't buy. Right? The deliberate nature of somebody going out on Twitter to say, I'm going to oppose this message, the fact that it's presented as a counter narrative, shot in the foot from the start. Any response on that? And that's maybe speaking to the sense of campaign as an advertising campaign. Speaking to campaign in the sense of a social movement or a social revolution, I would propose that social media in general is a radical media. It speaks to people who move against power because it enables access to power and to broader audiences. I'm not aware of a single instance where social media has been used effectively by those in power against those who do not have power. So how do you think that you can use, how do you, the officialdom, think you can use radical media against a radical actor?
Rusty, you want to try that?
I was going to say that I think the best example of a government using social media effectively is the government of Iran using social media, Facebook in specific, to terrify the Iranian community in Los Angeles by basically saying, you know, we know who you are, we know who your relatives are, and they're here in our country, and so you'd better not put up those tweets and all those posts you put up against us. So, and that has effectively shut up what was a very vibrant, attack against that. So I mean that's the example I put out. But I think just one other point about brand. I have trouble talking about branding in social movements in general, using the classic branding terminology, which is absolutely accurate. And I think while it's a good filter here, I just can't rate Black Lives Matter or Je suis Charlie as a brand somehow. They're incredibly effective slogans, and I think they show the incredible power of social media, because I was following in French and English all the tweets about what went on in Paris, and Je suis Charlie just kept rising above. It sort of through a process of elimination, it became the symbol of the whole event, because it was short, it was sweet. Americans didn't have too much trouble pronouncing it. So it became the emblem of that. And I think just to back to what you were saying about ISIS, I think the fact that ISIS, I think we can call ISIS now a master brand, because it's doing the one thing the U.S. government feared the most, which is that it is uniting under the ISIS brand umbrella, if you will, the various Al-Qaedas, Boko Haram, his allegiance, Al-Shabaab. All of these disparate movements are being gathered under one big brand umbrella. Yep. And as I say, that's the thing the U.S. government, and we're going to put the agency against them that came up with the amazing slogan, "Think again, turn away." Is that the best we can do? Anyway, I throw that out for provocation.
Edward, once again, you get a quick final word.
I would encourage you in your analysis to separate brand hashtags from campaign hashtags. Including what a government can do versus what a campaign can do. Mm-hmm. ISIS has managed to do the graduation from going to a campaign and making it into a brand, and maybe a combination of the two. But for the most part, they're two distinct things.
Great. Wonderful. And just, Amir, there are counter examples in terms of deliberate subliminal and not so subliminal messages being designed and then being sent out and actually influencing behaviors. So one thing that it's helpful for all of us to keep in mind is the audience here is a pretty sophisticated audience. So you see right through a lot of sort of coordinated campaigns. And the audience that many of these campaigns are trying to reach is not necessarily a graduate of the Fletcher School. And that's the assumption. Now, you may be absolutely right, but I just want to kind of plant that thought behind, in your minds. And that may or may not be right, but I think to some extent that's part of the assumption that a lot of marketers use, which is that everybody else is stupider than I am, so they don't get that I'm trying to manipulate them. With that, what I would suggest is if we could just form some short, really small buzz groups, no more than 4 or 5 people, and just have a conversation. You may just come up with, at the end, kind of saying, you know what, this is not going to work. But guess what? We actually do need to do something. We do need to come up with some ideas. So there's no point in saying, oh, this is all useless, right? So what is it? And just from a messaging standpoint, we're not going to solve the problems on the ground here. Okay, so let's take, I'd say let's take 10 minutes, and then we're going to have an open discussion about some of the ideas you guys had. For those of you who are aware of my annoying habit of playing the Jeopardy theme music, I will not do that and be kind to you. But it's why don't we capture the nuggets of a few things that you guys talked about, and let's share that with the room. To kind of kick us off, one question that at least in my mind was triggered by a really provocative tweet here from Dallin, which says, my question, with a conservative estimate of 40,000 plus Twitter accounts, how can ISIL leadership control its message? So coming back to the point that, the McDonald's campaign, whatever it is, it's still controlled by McDonald's marketing, and here you have 40,000, crazy people, not so crazy people, all over the globe, kind of potentially taking a message in different directions. So that's an interesting question to ponder, but also from the perspective of counter-narratives, just like when we think about blocking off access to capital or blocking off access to cities in any kind of warfare. Does this 40,000 strong network provide some avenues for blocking off access to narratives, such as if you infiltrate some of these accounts, can you actually get the counter-narrative to ride on top of these accounts and somehow, reverse the trend? I don't know. I'm just probably saying something I don't understand anything about, but I just thought I'd sort of throw that out. In any case, any quick comments on 40,000 accounts? Is that controllable, or you just assume that there's people who understand the basic image, the umbrella message, and they will just do the job?
I think it goes back to the earlier discussion of do you need governance to have a potent movement in a way, as opposed to something that is just spontaneous, maybe created or co-created, but that will not have the mightiness to engage. So marketers think about acquiring new customers and retaining them. In a movement, I think it's maybe mobilizing, engaging, and then getting the community to have a common denominator and act. So you need an element of governance, I think, of some sort to facilitate that. So the 40,000 account, that's great for the conversation, but then if you
so
go
you think
beyond,
of it as a point of vulnerability?
I think it is, and you don't have to infiltrate. I think you could have an over discussion and actually create an element of discussion.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So let's come back to the interdisciplinary part of Fletcher and the brilliant ideas that are going to be carried, hand carried to Washington, D.C. We need some mics here, right? Yeah. Not a question. You got answers. No more questions.
Well, so one of my questions is up there, which is more just a reflection on one of the things that was mentioned, which I think goes back to what the answer is. I thought it was interesting when we broke down these 5 components: identity, promise, consistency, badge, emotional space, and then relevance. And Bhaskar, you had mentioned, if we don't touch on this part, don't those other 4 fall away? And particularly, we hear this a lot about, why don't moderate Muslims speak out? Why aren't they part of the, driving this narrative? And I think the question a lot of times comes back to why is it that that is more relevant to the groups that find it that way? And why is it that they look at this and see ISIL showing more of an identity, more promise, consistency, giving that emotional space and badging such that they find it relevant? And particularly, I think it's because they don't, I'm mostly thinking of particularly immigrant populations in a lot of parts of Europe where a lot of these guys are coming from over. If they're not feeling like they fit that identity, that they don't have a promise, there isn't a consistency in how they're treated, they don't have any kind of badge to that, like all of this then when I start seeing rhetoric from ISIS would actually fit into that and find to be really very relevant to me. So to me, it's about fixing that component so that they don't line up with these, which is the bigger issue. I think ultimately though the hashtag game is playing on their level, which really it should just be a comedy.
And so specifically, what would you recommend the State Department agency to do?
One thing we had kind of discussed was why there wasn't more back and forth with, say, Department of State or CIA hashtags against theirs. But I think the larger issue is making sure that they don't identify with those first four components because the hashtag game isn't relevant.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brendan. On.
Thank you. So I think that Professor Matos got it exactly right. You need to bring it local. You think about when action from the digital world goes to the physical world, and it's often the opportunities that are local. So if I text the city of Cambridge and say there's a pothole on Beacon Street, and I see that pothole being fixed, that's more exciting to me than if I put a hashtag out that has no relevance to my daily life. So I think the solution is to somehow involve the players on the ground, the local capacity on the ground, and bridge that digital and physical world.
Great point. Go ahead.
I think there is strong need to separate hashtag awareness to activism, right? What I see with that 40,000 Twitter accounts can leadership control? Probably not. What they are doing, the hashtag activism is hashtag is doing is creating awareness of an activism campaign, which is very nicely codified, right? Has an ideology, has set of benefits, etc. That is clearly codified. To counter that, you need to have, again, a very strongly thought of thing, trying to understand what the ideology is, where are their pitfalls, and develop a strategy or develop a campaign on the other side, trying to show the people who are getting attracted that this is not the only side of the world that you can see. There is this other side that also you should see, and that should be very focused campaign effort, focused effort from the state government. And probably then you can hijack these hashtags in which they are using for their campaigns and insert these also so that people who are watching these hashtags and watching this can see a different view of the world. That could be potentially one way to do it.
So how confident are you that that would work? Because essentially you're saying just give them the alternative vision.
Yeah, that is just one part of the point. I mean, there are multiple elements to it, right? Like he said, there are ground realities which do not really match up. But you can do some elements of that through a media campaign. It might not be the entire thing, but people will at least see that there is a different worldview that exists, which may not be what I believe, but something that something that if then that needs to be probably complemented with on-the-ground activities which help in another way.
Great, fabulous. Okay, Ali, could you just pass the mic down, please? Thank you.
We also talked about alternate world views, but we talked about the importance, as Professor Simonin said, of finding an opportunity to identify the root cause of why people are joining ISIS or ISIL in the first place. And we also came at it from a Western European perspective, mostly from our side too. But we were saying that, a lot of us see the social benefits that you talked about, or just feeling like you can't assimilate to a certain community or be recognized or be valued as a contributing member of society as a reason people are joining this. But the reality is that people aren't fired up about the fact that that's happening, because that could be an alternate narrative, right? Like that, yes, that it's wrong that, young Western Muslim Americans can have, or not Americans, but young Western Muslims can have trouble assimilating into a community. That makes me angry, and that doesn't mean that you should go join ISIL. And that's the message that the American government needs to be communicating, is that there are people who are fired up about that, but I'm not so sure that there are people that are fired up about that root cause, and that's kind of the problem and the issue that we discussed. But if there are people who are fired up about what's driving people to join, then they need to be identified, and to Rusty's point, there needs to be a network of events and people that are sharing that that message.
Just to add on that real quick, I think in terms of do's and don'ts, do vocalize the issues, like as the State Department, do vocalize the issues that you identify as the causes for people to join ISIL. Like we realize that you feel marginalized in our society, something like that. And I think in terms of don'ts, do not tell people no, because that's probably, I think parents who tell their kids no know exactly where that leads.
Okay, all right. Could we just, we're getting a number of Western perspectives. I know that you had a perspective from Iraq, right? So could we just get some voice from over here? Yeah.
I hope I don't come out sound in a way that challenging the whole thing that we are talking about.
Oh,
but
please do.
ISIS has a very clear political incentive and narrative and propaganda. What it's doing in order to intimidate and control Mosul or Raqqa or Tikrit, nowadays they are fighting since weeks and nobody can know what's going on there exactly, is not through Twitter and social media and Facebook. Now I understand what we are talking now, it's how this corresponds to the Western population. In order not to get into the details about what's going on inside Iraq and Syria in terms of the fight against ISIS or with ISIS, let me focus here on the counter-narrative. Counter-narrative does not work that the State Department has its own big label there. Because those people from the Western Europe or from America who are listening to ISIS, number one, mainly they are Muslim with very light or kind of weak roots to Islam itself. And that's what's in many books of ISIS. They are focused on those people who doesn't have the depth and knowledge and understanding of Islam. So the way to lure them to this propaganda is easy. So the first thing is that to understand what's really ISIS is appealing. It's not Islam and Jannah and Allah and all this stuff. What is appealing is political empowerment. What is appealing is self-recognition. And third, there is a line of Islamists there, which is, by the way, ISIS is the weakest, it doesn't care even to really refine its Islamic ideology or Islamic reaching out to the people, because they are not interested in that so much.
So how do you develop a counter-narrative based on that?
The counter-narrative, number one, talk to Azhar in Egypt. Talk to Islamic universities in Turkey. Bring Qatar, the name that's very big in funding those militant, and let those people who are branded to be sided with this kind of terrorism or like Islam is the root cause for it, let the Azhar lead such an effort. Leave or bring those names. I know so many Islamic scholars from Europe who have a real clear message about Islam. They are young, they are active, they are modern age, so they know how to lure those Muslim young population in the west of Europe or in America with the message that starts from Islam, but it's not the message of ISIS. If we look into Think Again and stuff like this is not what the Muslim guy in Europe is interested to listen about thinking again. He's looking for something deeper than this. And in Islam, as with any religion, with Buddhism, with any religion, has certain depth of it if you dig a little bit deeper and not act as fire extinguisher. they Twittered then, and then they Twittered back, and okay, by this way we're gonna liberate Mosul. There is no way.
Okay, so
Thank
if I may just sort of recap that, which is, create the counter narrative through a network of more credible names from within the neighborhood as opposed to from DC.
A name that Mosul recognized.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to Natalie and you. Yeah.
And I would say, in terms of that, for the State Department, I think one of the things that struck me in one of the readings is that the people who are running this operation of the counter-narrative are not communications experts. They're not people that know how to run social media or how to develop a narrative, or they're not necessarily the right people that can build up a counter-brand or a counter-campaign. And so for me, that's almost the first thing, is to get the right people working within the State Department who understand the need to build a narrative, like you're saying, to appeal to these people that are going over to ISIS, to make it strong enough that it can stick, versus the very strong ideology that, ideology and ideas that ISIS is currently pushing.
Yep. Great.
So I'm thinking about actual policies that we could use. There's so many people that have gone to Syria and have been dissatisfied or disenchanted with the stories and the perceptions that they have of what Syria actually will be and what fighting for ISIL or other armed groups would be. And there are at least 300 who have returned to Tunisia, 180 in Germany, just for example. These are narratives that can help keep people from going there in the first place, because their message is as much theirs as anybody's, because the lack of reporting within ISIL areas is what allows them to control that message. When they say, this is what we do, that's what people believe they do. All the atrocities, all of the good things when they say that they're bringing in aid and restoring trade and farming for certain communities, or fighting against the apostates of Islam. Those are narratives that I think are even more important than Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar is always issuing things, talking about how I've heard many of them. That's happening. But the credible narratives that we need are those that have gone there and found out that it's not what it appears to be. But second, because they have such a social media presence, there's plenty of opportunities to address that. I watched a video today of a journalist who had dressed herself in a niqab and was speaking with an ISIL fighter who was coaching her on how to come to Syria. And that was a good deal of time. It was a good way for her to gain some information on ISIL. But there are plenty of ways that we can not necessarily counter the narrative, but take up their time with fake accounts or fake people who are making them frustrating their purposes almost. If they spend hours a day trying to bring converts or new people.
So you can just have actors?
Just have actors.
Okay. All right. So have some real people and some actors. And so let's just take one more point here, and then I'd just like to get some observations from the panel back.
Yeah, I want to go back to messaging. I was looking, at the messaging techniques that they're using here, and they're authoritarian. And I'm going to mix Black Lives Matters in with this as well, and why people have attached themselves to this. We get, Black Lives Matter is people minorities within Western nations. They get this sense that they don't matter, and the U.S. doesn't have or doesn't release a positive message or a positive image or narrative for Muslims or Blacks or Hispanics. And when they do try to address these different people, they do things like think again, turn away. It's kind of like a directive. It's not a message that anyone can relate to, except to say, again, we don't matter, that what we think or how we feel about something is just do what we tell you and without question. Or it's kind of like some sort of parable, how can slaughtering the innocent be the right path? It's directional. It's not engaging.
Okay, great. I'm sorry, I just do need to start wrapping this up, any closing thoughts based on some genuine insights that at least I thought I heard from my colleagues here? Reactions?
Yeah, I'll say something. I think, again, what I heard is that we need an integrated strategy.
I don't know if this mic is working. You can try
no?
this.
Okay. All right. An integrated strategy. I think the focus on whether it's Al-Azhar or any other sources of learning in the region. So voices from the region, number one. This can't just come from outside and go in. It needs to be organic in some respects. Number two, number two, you're up there. Okay, number two, I was reminded of the Samizdat dissident press during the Soviet Union. I mean, we're talking about a totalitarian organizational structure, and what you're saying is exactly what dissidents did and what the Samizdat did. I mean, they presented the alternative to what, the kind of totalitarian imaging was. And so I think your point is really important, and so marrying those together. And then the third point, which all of you keep talking about, and the Cambridge pothole, thing really resonated with me. The importance of, again, connecting the message to the physical reality, which is that all the good messaging in the world isn't going to matter if on a daily basis what people experience is different from that messaged reality. And I think connecting all three of those main points, you get to this need for a multi-pronged, integrated, long view strategy, and there are not going to be any easy fixes on this. And that's the difference between the hashtag. The hashtag is now, it's ephemeral, it might be sustained, but what people are looking for is long-term change on the ground, because that's why these narratives to begin with have appeal, because their physical reality, their lived reality is so ugly.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Elizabeth. Any other 1 minute lightning round? Final comments, final thoughts?
Just in a few seconds, thank you for all the great ideas. I think it goes back to the issue also of authenticity and the credibility of the source. I think it cannot be amateur's night all over again. I think if you are going to do something, you need to bring the professionals, people who understand how to deal with teenagers, people who are vulnerable. Same thing in problems of social marketing, the don't drink, don't drive, don't do this, don't do drugs. Well, the form is very important, understanding actually the psychology of it. So bring the experts in the field. You cannot fix that just with money. I think you need to have the expertise. And you have to engage the communities, the thought leaders, and the influencers, the true credible sources who are going to be listened to and possibly make people pause. So you can facilitate maybe the engagement of others. Your own personal engagement as a State Department may be only limited just because of who you are, but you can facilitate the role of others who have a better shot at it. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Bernard.
There was a piece in the New York Times about a week ago written by a psychologist or sociologist saying, we've done wonderful controlled experiments on things like drinking and drugs and so much. We've never done one on what works to try and have somebody not be violent or become a terrorist. So we've never done the real studies on that to see what actually works. Number two, I wonder if there isn't a branding campaign that the government could do, but it's not one to try and change ISIS. It's just one to try and ameliorate a little bit the image of the American government. It's such a negative reaction to it. Maybe they could do something, and I put this out for you guys, a branding campaign that makes the United States not look so bad.
Well, yeah, Rusty, your lighting remarks.
Just because I mentioned measures and success, let me put 3 measures out to you so we can judge this. I mean, assuming that more and more of this is going to play out online as opposed to in the real world. I mean, I think that social media and messages that come over social media will have passed a point when we can get beyond the sort of facilitation or recruitment phase, if you will, and they really get into being able to organize. That's one measure. Another measure is when they get from being a good place to seed ideas to really developing ideas. There really isn't a conversation on social media. There are tweets and retweets. There are posts and reposts, but there's no real conversation. So ideas may be planted, but they don't germinate. And if they do, how do you know whether the guy who's answering you is legitimate or not? So once they get past that point, that's the second one. The third one is if we can deal with how fast they ramp up. they ramp up so fast and they go to such a size, and where we can get to a point where those ramped up people can make collective decisions, then we'll know that there's a maturity level there. So you're all going to be in part of that generation. So I leave you with those thoughts.
Great, thank you, Rusty. And as I always say that there's no such thing as hashtag on the other hand. So you better, whatever message you need to get out, you got to get the kind of the one-handed message out. I think we actually have had in this very short session a ton of insight, which if John Kerry were here, he would be furiously taking notes. And hopefully he'd be furious with the folks he had put on the job. But I do believe that there are some some key insights for all of us to continue to noodle on as far as this topic. And I do see the connect, despite the pushback in terms of this is not quite the same as branding. You see a lot of similarities when you think of a lot of advertising. Advertising is localized. The good advertising is targeted. So the Cambridge pothole analogy is that's what Google thrives on. Second, some of the most effective advertising comes from so-called authentic users. So I just come out of a McDonald's restaurant and I've just munched on the Big Mac and I'm looking really happy, and underline yeah, and it says not an actor, and that really makes me want to, and so there's an element of that. But at the same time, kind of there are some power nodes. There are some respected elements, who have the ability to attract a lot of followers. So it's not just the people who have returned from Syria and now, kind of say, wow, what was I thinking? But also potentially some of the influential organizations, institutions, imams in the region who have that followership. So it's not an either or. It needs to be a combination of all of the above. It certainly does not call for hashtag John or @John Kerry being the author of these messages. That would be a complete disaster. In fact, that was one of the branding changes that we do need to bring about in the region. So first of all, thank you for all of you for kind of forsaking half an hour of social hour for this. This is obviously a topic that is not going to go away, but this is a topic that is enlightened by a lot of your thinking. And feel free to continue to sort of not just think about it, but propagate this. We do have the hashtag that will allow you to multiply your thoughts, and perhaps we can actually put something coherent. We already just through the notes that we pulled together here, we can put together something pretty coherent that Elizabeth, on your next trip to Washington D.C., and Edward, the next major media organization you sit down with, maybe we can get the word out. So a round of applause to our wise men and women here. And an even louder round of applause for the even wiser interdisciplinary men and women on that side of the room. Thank you.